and the University of East London. My name is Dr. Julie Wall, and I'm a reader of computer science at the University of East London, and I will be moderating the session today. Before we begin though, our provost, Professor Hassan Abdallah, sends his apologies for not being able to be here, but has prepared the following words.
Okay, back to you, Julie.
So, as I said, welcome everybody to this very relevant discussion on the value of explainable AI, where we were trying to talk about how are we planning to tackle the black box problem of AI-based decision making, and more importantly, why do we need to make AI explainable? A recent development in automation using machine learning and deep learning has empowered the technological industry to solve many complex problems, which were not so easy in the past. At the same time, it has also raised a few issues. One of these is being the explainability of a model. How does it arrive at a decision? So to discuss this topic, we're delighted to invite expert speakers from industry. I'm sure it'll be fascinating to hear their insights and experiences. So first, let me introduce our expert speakers. And as I do, it'd be lovely if you could all say something about yourselves. Firstly, I have Nigel Cannings, CTO at Intelligent Voice.
Hi, Julie. Thanks very much. I'm Nigel Cannings. I'm CTO from Intelligent Voice. We specialize in speech recognition for privacy-sensitive environments, and we work very closely with UEL, working on a number of projects involving explainable AI.
Thanks, Nigel. Next, we have Rohit Talwar, CEO of Fast Future.
Hi, I'm Rohit Talwar. I'm a global futurist, and we spend our time advising clients on the emerging technologies that are shaping the landscape, in particular artificial intelligence, and trying to help people understand the challenges around explainable AI and how do you make your choices around the types of models to use and the trade-offs between the models and the risks that you face if you don't have explainable AI.
Lovely, thank you, Rohit. Next, we have Pete Trainor, CEO from Vala Health.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for the introduction. My name's Pete. I'm the CEO of Vala Health. We're a telemedicine platform. We have various components of AI running underneath our system, and because we're a healthcare on demand business, we obviously take ethics and explainable AI incredibly seriously for our members and audience. And we're really busy at the moment, so it's nice to have this distraction and come through to you. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And finally, importantly, we have Roger Willison-Gray, Corporate Affairs Director at IORMA.
Hello, I'm Roger. I'm the Corporate Affairs Director at IORMA. And for those of you not so familiar with IORMA, our remit, our goal is to look at things from the perspective of the consumer rather than industry. And I have considerable experience of working with small, medium and large size businesses in adopting new technology. AI is a hot topic at the moment. It isn't universally welcomed, and I think today's discussion will highlight some of the reasons for resistance to change that we experience on a practical basis, and I hope overcome them and allow us to move forward and adopt some of the exciting changes that are coming.
Thank you. So we anticipate that the panel discussion will last for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll have time for your questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat box on the side and we will read them out at the end. And then at the end, Roger, if you will wrap up the session for us.
Be delighted.
Lovely. Okay, so I think we start with something fairly high level, and some of you briefly touched on this during your introductions, but is AI a core component of your business products or services now? And if it is it something that you develop or is it something that you purchase off the shelf? Nigel, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Well, AI really is at the core of what we do. So speech recognition technology has been around for a long time, but it's really only taken off in the last few years with the explosion of accuracy that we get through using AI. So any of you use Alexa or Siri or Google or any of those things are at the consumer front end of the advances that we've made. We as a business, we focus on the private end of things. So we actually are very concerned about how you do speech recognition in an environment where it can't actually get into the cloud or into the public cloud, so kind of healthcare, those types of environments. For us, we had to build our own systems. When we first started doing this, there were no real AI systems around that were capable of doing speech recognition privately in the way that we do. And if we did use kind of public cloud components, then we'd be sacrificing a lot of the privacy that our customers demand. So yeah, we couldn't do what we do without AI.
Okay, good, interesting. And Pete, you mentioned briefly in your introduction, from a health point of view, is this something that you would use as a core component of your business, or services, I should say?
Yeah, we have kind of a number of algorithms running kind of all the time, actually, from a clinician and from a member point of view, a patient point of view. I mean, we try and not to refer to everything we do as AI. There are various subsets and components of AI that are running kind of collaborations of algorithms, is probably the best way of thinking about it. And it's a combination of bespoke and off-the-shelf services that are widely available, and we take a view on the ethics around using some of those off-the-shelf versus bespoke methods on a case-by-case basis. So, for instance, it would be pointless for us to try and develop speech-to-text interfaces for our doctors' note-taking, which is some of the things that we do. That would take us kind of a year to develop that really, really well, versus teaming up with other businesses that are already doing things like that. So we take it on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's unavoidable that a business like ours is running multiple algorithms for many, many different things. Predominantly natural language processing, that's our big one at the moment. That's what we've got 70% of our various components using. Yeah, it varies. But I think we measure it. We have a really tight ethics framework on how we decide what we're going to use and where we're going to use it and how that's going to be deployed.
Okay. And speaking of ethics, Pete, have you come across the term explainable AI before? And if so, is it a recent thing, or is it something that you've heard for quite a while?
I mean, I've been knocking around for 25 years in this capacity, data and design and AI and technology. So the various phrases that come and go, I have heard. I think what's important now is how we make some of these things. So yes, I have heard of it. It seems to be becoming more prominent now as the media and speculation around AI and hype takes over. I think we have to try and find a way to make everything digestible and useful to the end consumer. And so, whether it's going to be, we call it explainable AI to the populace is a debate that we should have. Certainly, the principles of being able to explain how something is working, processing, managing, consuming data, and how it's used and where it goes, and so on and so forth. That's something that we absolutely need to get right. We're regulated as a business, so to have our practicing medical license, so we absolutely have to make our systems transparent for doctors, consumers, and the regulator. So it's something I think we're going to be demanding anyway. Yeah.
Actually, that's an interesting point. Rohit, maybe you could pick up on that. Do you think explainable AI is coming through policy or regulation, or is it coming from our customers? Is it coming from your customers or clients? Who's pushing it, do you think?
I think it's coming from all directions. So the European Union tried to introduce some elements of this through the GDPR regulation, but we also have seen that clients are increasingly becoming aware that they need to be able to explain the decisions being made by the technologies they're adopting. And what we're seeing right now is that with so many people starting to explore AI, whether it's for group decision making within the organization or for applications that are customer facing, people are rushing into them at the moment because of the changes in the way they're having to do business. And it's highlighting this issue of, well, how did we get to that decision? Yeah. But it's also highlighting two other issues that are really interesting, I think, which is, firstly, how do we make decisions in all the other computer systems and applications we use? It's highlighting the question there that a lot of the time we just take for granted that once a system's tested, the answers it's coming up with are acceptable and correct and challengeable. But even more interestingly, it's highlighting for organizations that they don't have explainability around a lot of the human decisions they make. That when you make management and leadership decisions, when you set strategy, when you make resource allocation decisions, those aren't always as explainable as we'd like to think. And the reasoning paths we take aren't always that explainable. So I think explainable AI is actually opening up a very interesting door to looking at how transparent and how clear are our organizations in the way we make decisions, whether it's in human form or in technological form.
I think that's a really good, it's an interesting point. It's not something people will have considered if we're focusing so much on how the AI produces decision, but actually it's the human-based decision is what's developing the AI in the first place. Roger, you know, from IORMA's point of view, do you think explainable AI is something that the general public are even conscious of?
Certainly think that people are conscious of the effects of AI. Dealing with businesses, I often find when you specifically spotlight an AI solution, something that is going to do things differently, one of the biggest concerns is risk and accountability. So kind of echoing some of the previous comments, regulatory measures are important because they seek to remove that risk or at least to mitigate it. I think where things are algorithmic, for example, having an AI solution for planning deliveries for a courier company, if you don't quite get that right, and there's a commercial price to pay, but it's not particularly an issue. If you're using an AI solution to draft contracts, then there is potentially a much greater risk. So what I find with that kind of thing is it always ends up in the hands of a human being before it's issued to anybody. So there's a degree of lack of trust in AI systems. And I think, the more of a glass box we have where we can justify how that decision was reached, we'll gain the confidence of industry much more, and then perhaps allow some of the more more exciting developments to take place. Because at the end of the day, AI has the capability to completely revolutionize productivity. But what I see at the moment is most CEOs have got their hands on the brakes on that at the moment.
Nigel, as a company who develops most of your own products or all of your own products, who do you think this output should be explainable to? So when you're developing something, do you think it needs to be explainable to your own developers, or does it have to be to any regular person?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I draw a bit of a line between what you might call exposability and explainability. Because really, this whole thing runs at two levels, one of which is actually exposing mechanics of how a decision is reached. So, what is it in the network that activates? What are, if you're looking at behavioral stuff, what are the words that are triggering? What are the things which actually are being exposed by the network? And that's kind of exposability. Then you get into the explainability, which is actually, how would you, as a user, someone on the end of the phone who's just been turned down for a credit card, how would you explain to that person that they've been turned down? And I think we're getting really quite good at this exposability piece, and that is great for for my developers and my researchers and people like that. Where we still haven't really got to is that explainability piece, which I think is actually essential for end users. So it is, the person on the street, the person on the end of the phone, they're the ones who ultimately truly explainable AI should be, should really be aimed at. And I think we're still a way off making that easy for people to do as companies. We're still not great at doing the explainable bit, but we are really good at the exposable bit.
Okay. And Rohit, to follow up on that, if companies have developers who can explain, who can provide explanations, if they're able to understand that these models, what they're saying through exposability, do you think that's enough? Do you think that the company should be able to explain? That's for Rohit.
It all depends on the volume of the application. So as Roger was talking about earlier, if you're doing contracts, then you can put a human on the end of that and check what you've created and check the explanation and how the reasoning in the model works. But take, for example, what's about to be launched, where these government applications are going to come in to determine whether businesses can have the grants for the employees they furloughed, or 5 million people applying for their self-employed, benefit, or whatever it's going to be. Those are going to be very high volume applications where they need to be both exposable and explainable. The individual will need to have a very high level of explainability as to how the decision's been made. And then whoever's doing the vetting of this, National Audit Office or whoever, needs it to be exposable to check the underlying logic and how it's all working. And I think those are things that could get left behind a little bit as people are rushing to use AI solutions in the current work environment, that you need to have both. And my guess is, from talking to people, AI developers and anyone with any kind of skill in this area is in massive demand at the moment. So it could be one of the things that gets slightly left behind in the rush to get solutions to market. But what that means is that we'll end up with lots of legal cases afterwards and lots of challenge and lots of pushback to what's happened. So a little bit of extra care right now to make sure there is both exposability and explainability could save us a lot of issues slightly further down the line.
Yeah, that's a good point. Before actually we go too deep into these issues, first of all, I'd like to welcome all my students who should be online here today. And maybe we could look at more high level, like why do we want to have explainable AI? What are the advantages of it? Pete, can you maybe kick off with a few advantages?
Well, I mean, the advantages, especially in my field of work at the moment, are lives. So we support our clinicians with automation rather than have automation making the decisions. And I think that's a really important distinction here. So we as a business will not have algorithms make medical diagnosis or decisions because we don't trust it to do that yet. So we give our doctors basically the final say on everything, and that's super important. And it's because they're the ones that are going to have to explain to the patient why a decision has been made. So funny sort of way, we have to make sure that they know why the algorithm, why the systems that we put in place are giving them the recommendations that they're making, and then they have to interpret that and then feed that back to the end patient, the consumer. So keeping it simple for them is super important. It's meant to be there to make their jobs easier, not their jobs more complex. We would go back to doing it in a very old-fashioned, medical way of pure sort of doctor-patient if that was not explainable to the clinician, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Following up from that, as you say, doctors will always have the final say. It's basically, we're using AI for decision support. Do you think it will ever get to the point where the AI is an automation system which is completely taking over? Or are we always going to have a human in the loop?
Well, so there are businesses out there who I won't name, who are using kind of like AI-driven Medicare. There are already businesses that are popping up who are kind of algorithms supported by doctors rather than doctors supported by algorithms. Like that's their model. It's not our business model because we have chosen to be, human. And funnily enough, over the last couple of weeks, with everything that's going on in the country at the moment, our business has exploded. Demand for our business has exploded because in a time of crisis like this, people want to speak to a human being. They're starting to distrust machines at a time when they're incredibly vulnerable. So, that's exposed in some ways. What's happening at the moment is exposed some of the flaws in those tech-led businesses rather than those kind of tech-supported businesses, which is fascinating. And so I think, it will happen. The regulators, especially in our space, the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, the sort of Council of General Medical Practitioners and so on and so forth, they're really actually struggling in some ways to try and regulate, some of these businesses who are much more algorithmic, generating beasts than our doctors explaining to them how they're using the tools. And so there's going to be huge changes in regulation around this space in the next couple of years, but they're also learning how to regulate a space that ultimately ends in life lost or life saved.
Yeah.
The consequences can be tragic, so we have to be really careful.
Okay. And Roger, moving away from a very focused medical area, generally across companies using AI, what do you think the advantages of explainable AI is to them, to the companies themselves?
I think it comes back to your point about decision support or automated decision making. And what I see, if you look at agri-tech, for example, where there is automation based entirely on AI for things like fertilizing and determining meteorological patterns and things like that, which results in direct action. What you see in that kind of environment, and also perhaps in things like logistics, where you use machine learning to improve deliveries, the machines are allowed to make the choice, but it's subject to scrutiny. So if that choice resulted in, I don't know, a 30% increase in the cost of fertilizer, somebody's going to want to know the reasons for that. And back to my point about risk, really, explainable AI allows you to understand the risk and quantify it. You can keep up to date with regulations. For example, there are limits to the amount of fertilizer that you can pump into the ground. It provides really transparency from a decision-making point of view, because we can go back and correct the failure. There's on one of our podcasts, there's a good example of identifying wolves and dogs, and AI got it right every time, but for completely the wrong reasons, because all the wolves were pictured with snow in the background. Now, that's the kind of thing we need to be wary of in industrial applications. Medicine is a completely different ballgame, because the level of risk is huge. And there are other industries, self-driving cars, for example, where we'll have those complex questions as well. But I think generally, as an industrial tool, making it explainable is important from an economic point of view as well as a management point of view.
I think that example you gave of the wolves, predicting between wolves and dogs, is so famous, but I think it really emphasizes the issue of explainable AI. If they had used explainability in the algorithm, then they wouldn't have made that mistake. So Nigel, maybe is one for you. When you're developing these systems, how do you know that the answer you're getting is correct? Do you use explainability for this?
Oh God, there's a question. I mean, the traditional way of the right answer is actually to use ground truth as a means of determining whether the answer's right or not. So if your answer is binary, then it's fairly straightforward. I can match that against ground truth. But what I'm really trying to do is uncover the reasons why the system is getting things wrong. And for me, that's where the kind of explainability piece really comes in. And there's some really interesting examples around. We're discussing effectively bias in AI in that regard. How do I why is it that certain things in my case transcribe badly, or we get bad behavioral results? And so there's a very interesting recent example, a study a few days ago in the speech recognition world, about how the major speech recognition providers are much better at transcribing white people than they are African Americans. And if you haven't got a really good understanding of why your network is producing those results, then it's absolutely impossible to understand why you're getting things wrong. So I think we're pretty good at understanding whether the answer is right or not, but it's often really trying to understand why the answer is wrong, and that's where we're really using explainability at the moment.
Yeah, it is. It's a really tricky one. And Rohit, this area of bias, it's becoming ever more present in, people want to see bias being talked about. They want to see developers being aware of it. In my teaching, we talk to all our students about bias. How do you think explainability will help with bias? And do you think it's solving some of the problem or a large part of the problem?
I don't think explainability solves the problem of bias. It highlights it, because in most of the areas where we're surfacing bias in society, in the underlying data. So, you know, the legal judgment examples, all of the professional services firms have been using it and looking at things like internal promotion, allocation of people to projects, and it's surfacing the bias there.
Yeah.
It's not resolving it, but it's giving you the data with which to go back and challenge, for example, the partners in a law firm to say, look, the reason that minorities or women are not making it through to partnership level is because you're not putting them on the key projects. And then you have to go back to very human decision making and discussion to say, well, how do we address that? So I think it's very, very important, because it's surfacing the bias that we might not believe exists in society today. It's surfacing it with relatively hard data, but it still goes back to humans to then have to make the decisions about how do we change that, and do we start to have, if you like, reverse discrimination built into those systems. So, you know, if you want to get to the point where you have parity for women, for example, in terms of positions on boards, you know, do you have to go with positive discrimination to do that and build that into the algorithms that are evaluating candidates? Those are very human decisions to make, but the AI is highlighting the issue for us.
I like the way you summed that up, how AI is highlighting the issue. I think it's a nice way of explaining it. Roger, from your point of view, what do you think are the main challenges when developers, companies are trying to use or implement explainable AI?
I think we've got to be careful we don't look at AI in terms of the sort of big global implementations. And a few comments come in about things like DeepMind and some of the strategic initiatives, which are great, and I totally back those. But the reality for the majority of people in businesses around the world is, you know, looking at solving specific problems, and that's going to mean using AI tools rather than perhaps developing end-to-end AI systems. So I talked a bit about agri-tech, but the logistics industry is something I've had quite a lot of experience of, and things like loading car ferries, which is a fairly mundane problem, is extremely difficult to do on the fly as a human being. There are emerging AI systems which will do that and determine configuration of different decks and that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's
really where I see AI changing business in the short term. I think as I said, I think medicine and things like that will always be very specialized areas and will require much more leading edge thinking. But I think for most business people, they've got a problem to solve. If AI can demonstrably solve that problem economically or for the benefit of the business, then they're going to go down that route. But they will still want that AI to be explainable. In fact, it's probably more difficult to convince a board of 6 directors of a £10 million company to go on that round than it is to convince the chief medical officer that we should be using AI solutions to manage epidemiology. So I think, to me, explainable AI is an absolute necessity if we're going to see growth in real world applications.
Picking up on what you were saying about, you know, private companies, who's going to be held accountable in comparison to, say, government agencies. There's a nice question from one of my ex-students, Dowda. Nice to see you here. Nigel, I'll throw this one over to you. Should government enforce an AI registration agency to cross-check every AI product before beta or mass production? Is this something that you think is even realistic, or is it something that's necessary?
All new technologies are a wild west, and it doesn't matter what that is. And you know, let's go back to the motor car. So the motor car is the thing that, you know, we're all very used to now. But we had no safety standards in place. We had no driving licenses. You know, there were, you know, we didn't have road signs. You know, anything which would really curb this new technology. And So, you know, the famous example of someone having to walk in front of the car, which was allowed to go no more than 3 miles an hour with a red flag in front of it, was the kind of, you know, the early example of that type of big brother regulation of these things. So, you know, people are scared of AI. If I'm honest, I mean, you know, the concept of AI has been around for a very long time, and Pete made this point earlier that, you know, this is an industry that has been around since the 80s, and, you know, in many cases actually got its roots in the 1960s. So, you know, it's hit the mass consciousness. We're all worried about losing our jobs. We're worried about Skynet. We're worried about, you know, being all of us are going to be replaced in an instant in our jobs. And actually, there is a lot of truth in that. You know, a lot of middle-class professionals are going to lose their jobs in the next 10 years or so, when a lot of their highly skilled, human-driven jobs are being taken away by AI. So, you know, people have got a right to be scared. But I think that, you know, whenever new technology comes along, rather than taking a very big brother approach to this and say, right, you know, we're going to try and clamp down on it, we actually have to try and build a kind of societal, ethical framework and understanding of how we want to engage with these type of technologies. And that doesn't come from government stamping down on it. It actually comes from a conversation in society about what is important to us. You know, do we want all of our data being processed and held by the US, you know, these huge US companies? I mean, do we really want Google and Amazon and IBM and Microsoft to have every single piece of data about us and, you know, continuing to feed these things? You know, I personally, the lack of privacy that we have in the modern age frightens the hell out of me, and continues to do so. So where we need government to step in is to try and help shape those conversations, rather than kind of having someone with a clipboard at the office door, you know, ticking off what we are and aren't allowed to put out into the big wide world. But then, you know, being a technologist involved in selling AI, I would probably say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah. Based on what you were saying about privacy, I might throw this over to Rohit. What do you think about the balancing act between explainability and privacy? For example, if a company, as Nigel was saying, companies have huge amounts of information about each and every one of us. If we want to have those AI systems being explainable, do we lose our privacy along the way?
Inevitably, you know, the more explainability we want, the more verifiable we want the data to be, the more we have to accept that that data is going to be opened up. But I think right now the issue isn't that important compared to getting to better explainable and exposable models. Once we have that, then we can start to really understand how at risk is your data in this. Because your data is at risk as soon as it goes into an AI system. The explainability bit doesn't really expose it anymore. It's really whether we want AI determining, you know, what your benefits should be, what your tax rate should be, what healthcare treatments you should be able to access, or what the determination is of the diagnosis. The issue is that we're giving that data into those systems in the first place. That's where the privacy concerns are. It's less of an issue around the attempts to explain or expose the workings of the model.
What about in terms of, like, I would worry about transparency. Transparency in a system could reveal information about minority groups or vulnerable users. Do you think, is that something to be worried about, or do you think that's an issue at all?
It all depends on who it's transparent to. You know, if it's transparent to anyone who wants to look at that data set, then yes, that's a huge concern. But if it's only transparent to the people who are effectively auditing and validating that system, then we have to trust it in the same way as we have to trust that our data in the tax system or in NHS healthcare systems is tested and vetted by certain people. We trust that they're not going to expose that data in a broader way. So it's more about trusting, if you like, the owners of the systems to not misuse our data, and trusting the people who then vet those systems to not misuse our data. explainable AI just, I think, gives us a little bit more confidence that the way the data is being used is actually the way it was intended to be used, and that the decisions that are coming out are fair, unbiased, and transparent. And that should hopefully give us more confidence about the way these systems work, make them more of a glass box, and less of the kind of black box model that we have today, where we're just having to place our faith in the owners of the systems, the people who developed it, and the people who manage them.
Okay. But, Pete, maybe one for you, because you deal with a lot of, your company deals with a lot of personal, private information. Do you think that there should be transparency or explainability in the way that data is collected and processed before, rather than just saying we need to have explainability in a decision? Do you think there should be explainability in the whole process from data collection?
Yeah, I mean, we have to have policies in place for regulation purposes, so they're all up front. Frankly, nobody reads them because they're large tomes of legally generated, legalese that are there for regulatory purposes. That is a problem, and we've really tried to thin out transparency up front of the data collecting so that people can understand it.
Yeah.
And don't ignore it, and that's something. But then we rub up against the regulators who say you need more rigor in there, you need more legal stuff. So we definitely try and make that completely transparent. The other thing that we have to really balance here as well, and again, it comes to this, like, at some point, does transparency and being too transparent get in the way of the service you're trying to provide? And what I mean by that is, like, actually our patients, a fair portion of them don't actually care how their information is processed. Trust us as my team of doctors, to be doing the right thing. What they care about is that the output is right for them. So they care that the what happens at the end of a consultation is good for their health and the outcome is right. If we're using technology in the middle of that conversation to make that better, quicker, smarter, more efficient, make recommendations better, etc., etc., that's a benefit to them. I think it's one thing start to go wrong and that becomes really problematic. But definitely, I think we struggle sometimes with the volume that we have to say up front for legal reasons, being too transparent in the middle because it just gets in the way of providing care, and then at the end, how much information we have to give them about what we've done and why we've done it. We're actually at the moment to try and as a kind of an experiment, if you like, we're going to be launching we're currently running a kind of almost a separate version of the system that has more AI components in it that people have opted into. So they've kind of opted into a more automated version of the system, and that's got much more transparency and so on and so forth. Versus the more human-powered version, and we're going to sit on the two things side by side and see really what the end consumer of this product, where their benefit is to them. It is a fine balancing act. I have to say, I think the law actually gets in the way of some of this stuff. Sometimes it's not caught up with the consumer demand and the need to, provide better services and better care.
Okay.
We're going to be about, I think we're only a couple of years of getting it right, but there is a bit of a way to go, I think.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Nigel, another point of view now. So as a company who develops AI solutions, do you think there are downsides of creating a solution which is explainable? For example, we use black box solutions for years. They've worked really well. Maybe I'm answering my own question. What do you think are the downsides of creating explainable AI?
Well, I'm going to go back to a point I made a couple of minutes ago, and it's a slightly controversial point of view. The robots are coming in and they're going to put us all out of a job. I actually think that explainable AI is one of the things which is going to lead to the ultimate de-skilling of large parts of the workforce, because when we have, so the only way we'll ever have faith in AI is when we understand why it makes the decisions that it makes. So at the moment, you wouldn't trust a medical robot because you wouldn't trust it. You wouldn't trust a legal robot. Even when someone is accusing you of having made a fraudulent insurance claim, if it were a robot, you wouldn't actually trust it. But if we get to the point where we believe that AI actually makes better decisions than humans. And I'm going to come on to the point, that's the point that Rohit was making earlier, that actually, people actually often make terrible decisions and really can't explain them very well at all. And because if we made perfect decisions, we wouldn't need medical malpractice insurance, for example, because everything always worked. We wouldn't need professional indemnity insurance. So I think that there are some real threats to a lot of people's livelihoods going forward. Now, because we're human, we will always find a way of employing people in other capacities. The world didn't end when word processing came in, as a lot of people thought it would, that armies of typists would be put out of work and never work again. So, in a post-industrial age, we will still find ways of employing people. But yeah, I think that it is a real hidden danger that a lot of people don't realize. And I see law firms and all other sorts of people kind of putting their arms around this type of technology and saying, look, we're getting great at doing this, that, and the other with AI. And then in about 10 years' time, 90% of them will look back and really, really wish they hadn't. But yeah, so as I said, I think that there is that hidden danger there.
Okay. Just for the audience, please use the chat box if you have any questions, because we will pose them to our panelists. Because we have such a good panel and we have a lot of students watching this, I'm going to ask you all a favor, because you've all been in this industry with a lot of experience for a long time. Maybe you could just give some advice to, up and coming young students, developers who want to get in and maintain a career. So maybe, Roger, we could start with you. Do you have any advice for young developers trying to break through and maintain a career?
Well, basically, I've spent 30 years in the tech industry in one form or another, and I think over that period, from graduation, I've done everything from being a network technician to being chief executive of a medium-sized organisation. And so, my first point would be, your knowledge and skills are applicable in many different roles. Don't bracket yourself as being a something. Be an expert on where your knowledge is and look for ways to apply it, because some of the people I come across in the most amazing roles turn out to be former surgeons or jobs that you wouldn't have expected that career to have gone in that direction. And I think particularly to Nigel's point, the world's changing so fast, it's almost difficult to predict what's going to be the top 10 jobs next year, let alone next decade. And I know it's been mentioned many times before, but I think something like the top 5 jobs in terms of careers at the moment weren't around 10 years ago. So it's really important to keep that open mind and open perspective and look to make a change.
Okay, thanks. Rohit, maybe you could add something. Students going through computer science or AI degrees now, what do you think they should be focusing on?
We're having just tried to answer questions and listen to people at the same time. Multitasking, particularly for men, I think is going to be a critical one. But I think right now, rather than trying to pick out specific jobs for 5 years plus, we know the next couple of years it's going to be things like data scientists, working in any aspect of machine learning, neural network development, AI and any of its applications. There's going to be a massive explosion of those, and the pandemic, I think, is just going to drive that as more and more people look to take humans out of their business and take the variability out so that they don't suffer a slowdown in their business when we're all sent home. But I think you also need to think beyond just the technical skills. I think that what's really going to make people employable are things like the ability to collaborate, the ability to communicate really clearly, and to explain, if you like, explainable human decision making, to learn how to explain your knowledge in a way that mere humans can understand. One of the most interesting things about all the literature about explainable AI is most of it is incomprehensible to the average person, and it really requires you to have a real depth of knowledge about it before you even read it. And I think the people who are going to be in most demand are those technicians, those people with AI, data mining, deep learning skills, who can really explain to business leaders and managers exactly what they can do with the technology, how it works, and really, you know, take away the fear that there will be from a lot of businesses that want to move in this direction, but also know that the history of investment in IT isn't a very good one. The OECD tells us that over the last 20 years, for all the investment in IT, there's been a zero impact on productivity. And time and again, we see studies saying that 70 to 80% of all digital transformation projects either fail or fail to make a difference. So business leaders are very worried about this. And the more they're going to be reliant on AI, the more worried they're going to become. And so there's a real opening for people who are really good communicators around the technology, who can stand in the shoes of the business leaders who are trying to use this and the business users, and really explain this stuff in a way that, you know, imagine explaining it to your father or your 7-year-old cousin. Actually, they'll probably already know more than you, but, you know, to people who really have no knowledge about this, and learn those kinds of skills. And I think those are the people who are going to stand out and really do well.
I think that's a point I've never really considered before. Communication skills, because we work so much with our students, you know, preparing them for employability, but that is something we will now take up. Thank you for that. Rohit, Pete, maybe you could add something more for young developers coming through.
Yeah, I've got two quick ones. In the first chapter of my book, I wrote, it's called the Accidental Polymath, and what I was trying to explain is that the very best developers I've ever worked with, the data scientists, are the ones that have really studied outside. They're kind of T-shaped, so they've really studied, you know, psychology and philosophy and art and literature, like other things other than the discipline that they're obsessed with learning and doing. And I think that creates the kind of developers and data scientists who can question themselves or think a little bit more kind of strategically or creatively than just, you know, doing the thing that they set out to do. That was one piece of advice that I gave. The other thing I guess is that the developers that I have, they're amazing people. If they cannot document something and explain it to me, it's not going in. Like, it's just that. So if we have a system, a machine learning system that's going to sort of exponentially start to modify itself and get better and do things, we still need to be able to go back to the original code base. We still need to go back to the original algorithms and say, like, how is it doing that? So being able to just not like bolt straight into the coding stuff and the you know, the fun stuff, if you like, being able to take your time and generate explanations of what you've done and how you've done it is hugely important. And frankly, your work's just not going to go. It's not going to go live unless it's explainable to at least the people that are signing it off. So get good at documenting.
Okay, Nigel, where do you think explainable AI is going to go in the next 10 years?
Well, explainable AI is going to be fundamental to everything we do. We're going to insist on it, that every single machine learning model that is ever deployed anywhere is capable of telling its users, you know, exactly why it reached the decisions it made. I think what's going to change, though, specifically, is that is going to come out of the realms of data science. So at the moment, you know, we still think of this as very much a data science driven type of discipline. I think that in the same way that, you know, people are now able to use an iPhone, for example, the kind of democratization of technology, that's where we're going to go with AI, where it ceases to be something magical and wonderful and just becomes part of everyday life. So that explainability actually is going to be fundamental to that democratization. So I see that that's where we're going to end up in the next 5 to 10 years or so.
Okay. Roger, when we come to developing AI from a technology point of view, it's a difficult task, you know, trying to get access to data, you know, it's not an easy thing. Do you think there is still maybe an expectation from the general public that AI is at a more advanced level than it actually is? And do you think that is causing issues in terms of expecting things to be explainable when their expectations are already so high?
I think it depends at what level you're dealing with it, and I'd really come back to what I think it was Rohit said about incomprehensible documentation. So at one level, at the strategic level, I think it's relatively easy to see the benefits of AI, and you certainly see politicians and business leaders understanding the potential impact of it. I think the challenge for, if you like, the average person is that they're not able generally to absorb, from whatever discipline, complex documentation, complex explanations. And there is this mystique around AI. And in fact, I was actually involved with a client last week. We've had to postpone it for the moment, but we were putting in an AI and machine learning system into a 5-man business to provide a highly sophisticated email automation system, because they get a lot of web inquiries that they just can't process. Immediately can see the benefit of why we do that. Took a bit of convincing that the machine would be able to respond and learn, and is now happy from an investment point of view. But if I asked him to explain what we'd done and what the value of it was, he would struggle, the managing director of the business. I find that people don't have the attention span to deal with complex explanations. And the challenge with that is, if you don't give them a detailed explanation, you then run the risk of oversimplification. And Alexa is an excellent example of how to oversimplify the entire process. You know, come across people socially, and they're sort of saying, well, it doesn't do what I tell it. And then you're into quite a long conversation. And I'm sure all of the audience would be more than happy to have that conversation. But the reality is, somebody's bought Alexa because they've seen a TV advert that says it can turn the lights on and off. And then they say, Alexa, turn the lights off. And then it's like, well, it doesn't work. You know, so it's that trade-off, I think. I have a particular interest in the sort of legislative areas of technology, having been through a number of waves of technology in my career where it was going to dramatically change everything from, you know, unified communications, office automation, e-business. These are all things that were going to revolutionize the world. And looking back, none of them ever did. I think where we're going with AI is along the lines of the sort of e-business revolution. And when I was at IBM, we stuck an E in front of everything, a red E. Yeah. And it was an IBM trademark, and everybody got very animated about how e-business was going to change the world. And I went to a sort of futurologist convention, and one of the guys was quite insightful. I can't remember his name, but a Japanese guy who was particularly brilliant. And he just came in and he had a slide, and his first slide had e-business, and then his second slide he just dropped the E, and he said, that's where we're going. And I think AI will just become part of our landscape. My big concern is whether the legislative and regulatory frameworks will keep up. I noticed quite a lot of questions popping up about should we have agencies to regulate things, and in my experience, no, because you'll never get them to understand the problem. But if you look at what happens in a commercial world, one of the areas where there is massive abuse still is marketing. We've got GDPR, we've got layers of regulation, but we still can't stop rogue marketing, even criminal marketing, which is, you know, spoofing and that kind of thing. We've got to make sure AI doesn't get hijacked and taken into spaces where it can cause damage. And I think that's my personal priority, really, I suppose.
Okay. You just had a nice comment from Pete that you just trigger the Alexa devices in everybody's office. Well, in everybody's home, since we're all working remotely. I'm just having a look at the questions. So the audience have put up some questions which have already been answered actually by our panel members. Let me just go through them. So I like this one. This is from David Wood, and we've already had an answer from Rohit. So maybe we'll throw it over to Nigel. Nigel, this from David Wood. Can we be confident that the explanations offered by an explainable AI system actually reflect the underlying reasoning processes of the deep network, rather than being just a plausible output? Is it actually the real output?
Yeah, well, it depends on where you're looking in the network, really. If you're only looking at the top end, which is just by looking at ground truth, then the reason why it reached that decision could be completely flawed. So, it giving the right answer for the wrong reason, effectively.
Yeah.
So I think it really depends on how deep your explainability goes. And, we build networks right down to kind of individual behavioral features, for example, and saying, what is it in that particular behavioral feature that trigger the network? And we do a lot of work with linguistics. So, which words, which phrases were it that actually triggered that? And then moving that up to a meta layer. So I think that it goes back to my point earlier about exposability versus explainability. You have to expose the workings. And if you can expose the workings, then it will actually help you with the explanation. And once you've done that, then, curiously, of course, it then becomes a human being who has to decide whether or not you've reached the appropriate conclusion. And actually, their view could be flawed. So, there's only so far you can go with that. But I think you expose the mechanics, and at least you can begin to understand whether it's the right answer, the wrong reason, or not.
Lovely, thank you. I think we're running out of time, so I have two more questions, both from the question and answer. And Rohit, you started to answer this one, but I'm going to ask it to you again. The question is from Robbie Stamp. Does informed consent mean anything now, or has that horse long since bolted? Can you explain what you understand by the term informed consent?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think there's probably a different interpretation for everyone you put it to. And yeah. I would hazard a guess that a significant part of the population don't have a clue what you mean. To me, it means that when I sign up for something, to use my data or to use a particular application, I know what I'm signing up to, and I know the ways in which they're going to use my data. That's what I think it means. Now, the challenge is how many of us read the data, how many of us understand the ways in which it's going to be used. And I think we have to, A, be much clearer in explaining what it is, and B, explaining what it means in the context of the application. So whether it's, using Zoom, whether it's using Facebook, whether it's, using WeChat or whatever, what are they allowed to do with your data? Who can see your data? What happens when your data gets aggregated? How many different ways are they doing that? Because we need to understand all of those things. But again, most of us have a goldfish attention span. And so, you've also got to get that across to the viewer, the listener, the app user in a 3-second message. I think it's a massive challenge. The horse hasn't completely bolted, but I think we're going to have to do a lot of work to make sure citizens are protected on their own behalf around this stuff.
Okay, thank you. I think you have provided a very relevant explanation to that term. Last question, I think I'm going to throw over to Pete. I'm just trying to find it. So it's from Tommy McDonnell on the question and answer. And his question is, if knowledge is not explainable, example, my medical consultant, why should AI be?
Good question. But again, realistically, somebody has programmed that decision-making expert system, so they should be able to explain why it's made the decision. That's a really good question. I think, as with all of these things, there are good practitioners and there are people that aren't so good, and there's some pretty terrible ones. Systems that are emulating or supporting those good, bad, or mediocre practitioners in any field will often be almost carbon copies of those people as well. So it's almost an impossible answer, an impossible explanation to give. There'll be good versions and there'll be bad versions. That's pretty much all I can say on that one.
Okay, thank you, Pete. I think it's time to wrap up. So before I pass over to Roger, I'd just like to say personally thank you to all the panelists for their really clear, considered responses, and to all of the audience members who put up some fantastic questions. Thank you. So Roger, I'll pass it over to you to finish up.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank you, Julie, and all of the panel for their time and support, and for bringing us their views on this really important topic on behalf of IORMA, and also to say that we will be, this is the first, I hope, of many IORMA webinars, changing behaviour driven by circumstances, but perhaps, I think somebody said to me the other day, this might just become the new normal. I think we've got a way to go with improvements in technology, and I'm sure AI will be able to contribute to that. Yeah, we hope to see all the attendees again at one of our webinars in the future, and thank you all very much for your time and support.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, everybody. And I think we will leave it there. See you all. Bye.